as you know, CCL had to pivot a good deal during the reconciliation process in Congress when we came close, but failed to push through a carbon fee and dividend proposal, which Joe Manchin in particular did not favor. Nonetheless, we got through some exciting legislation, and I want to talk about how it sets the stage for furthering our long-term agenda. And there we go. So let's dig in here. Oops. So first, I'm going to have a few brief remarks on the Inflation Reduction Act. Those of you who want more detail can go to a dedicated page about the IRA on the CCL community site. There's lots of good information there, including a long presentation by Dana Nuccitelli, who is one of my colleagues in the research group at CCL. Then I'll explain why a carbon tax, instead of being rendered unnecessary, is in fact the next logical step for ratcheting down emissions, and why the IRA actually helps pave the way for that instead of being in conflict. So I think we have a win-win situation here. Well, the Inflation Reduction Act, as probably all of you already know, will involve spending something on the order of either $369 billion, or I think the Congressional Budget Office actually pegged it at $386 billion over the next 10 years on a variety of climate-related measures, including $150 billion or so for producing clean electricity through various subsidies and investment tax credits. And you can see here, this is developed by a Princeton group. The left-hand side of this chart shows business as usual with some of the climate provisions of the infrastructure bill that passed earlier. And you can see some moderate gains for renewable energy over the years. The right-hand side shows a much steeper upward path in these forms of clean energy that will be created by the incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act. The act includes much more than that, of course. It includes incentives for purchases of electric vehicles, all sorts of building energy efficiency equipment, including heat pumps, for example, for both air and water, and many, many other important provisions. Well, the net result of all of these provisions will be to promote some very impressive reductions in national greenhouse emissions. The baseline business as usual case would bring us down about 27% in emissions from the peak of 2005. And this baseline includes things like the infrastructure bill and ongoing squeezing out of coal in generation thanks to natural gas and so on and so forth. But the Inflation Reduction Act will help get us a little more than half the way from that business as usual to our Paris commitment of a 50% cut in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. That gets us to that 40% level that you see. So that's the really good news. It's still, however, 600 million tons a year short of meeting our Paris commitment. That 10 percentage points is still a big unmet gap. I mentioned the cost of the bill, but let's not forget the benefits side of the equation, which is just gigantic. This chart is based on a study by the Office of Management and Budget that came out recently about the social benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act. And I have revamped the chart based on a new study that appeared September 1st in Nature by 24 quite eminent researchers around the country who re-estimated what's called the social cost of capital. And that basically is the global cost of every additional metric ton of CO2 that's emitted into the Earth's atmosphere in terms of effects on everything from human life to, say, loss of farm income from droughts or floods. As you'll see, the kind of midpoint estimate here is for benefits by 2050 of just over $3 trillion. That's absolutely staggering. A huge, huge return on investment. So bottom line here is we should, I think, hugely celebrate the Inflation Reduction Act. And we should then look very much forward to what we need to do to get first to that 50% commitment that the United States has made by 2030, and then to the net zero by 2050 goal that I think most climate activists now share. And as our fearless leader, Madeleine Paris, said, we're eager to build on at when the IRA passed. We're eager to build on today's big step forward and continue to work for even more and even better climate action in the future. So I've suggested that we coin a new phrase going forward for CCL, which is let's build back better. Maybe maybe our marketing department can come up with something better than that. Anyway, if we are going to build back better in one form or another, we need to try something new, not just more of the same. Simply adding more and more subsidies into the mix, more regulations, and so forth. It's going to do a lot of good, as I've just said, but doing more in the future is going to run into rapidly diminishing returns. The most obvious way is simple budget math. The Democrats who passed this bill were able to raise a variety of taxes so that there's actually net deficit reduction over 10 years from this bill, but that's going to be harder and harder to do. The more we spend on new subsidies, the more we're going to have to raise taxes or see our budget deficits balloon, neither of which is very attractive. Secondly, there's a law of diminishing returns here through subsidies, which is, yes, as we make clean energy cheaper, that will displace some fossil fuels, but not all. You are never going to drive fossil fuels out of the market just by subsidizing green energy. The fact is, there's still too many really cheap reservoirs of fossil fuels out there that just, unless you raise their price, they're not going to be outcompeted. You also have trillions of dollars of infrastructure built around fossil fuels that's already out there. It's paid for. You might write it down if cleaner forms of production start competing, but you're basically trying to compete against a huge sunk cost of infrastructure that uses fossil fuels. And again, unless you raise the price of that, it's going to be really tough to compete it out of existence altogether. Cost effectiveness is a big issue for a variety of reasons. One is that you end up spending a lot of subsidies on people who would have done what you wanted them to do anyway. A great example is with electric vehicles, where you end up paying subsidies maybe to 4 people. Out of every, say, 5 people you give subsidies to, 4 of them would have bought EVs anyway. So you end up spending something like $50,000 for every new EV that you incent to be purchased. That's just not very cost effective. You also run into the problem that as you subsidize certain industries or sectors, you develop political coalitions that want subsidies forever. Great example being the ethanol industry, whose environmental and climate effectiveness is very dubious, but whose political power seems absolutely untouchable. So you can end up squandering a lot of subsidy on programs who, even if they were justified at one time, aren't any longer. And last but not least, subsidies inevitably have to be targeted at certain sectors, certain industries, whatever. So they're limited in scope. They also take time to implement, write the regulations for, and so on, so they don't take place right away. So these are all reasons why the approach taken in the Inflation Reduction Act isn't the ideal approach. Fortunately, as I imagine some of you guessed, carbon taxes don't suffer these problems. They can take effect almost overnight because we already have federal excise taxes on these fuels. All you have to do is raise them according to their carbon content. Because fossil fuels are ubiquitous, when you tax them, you're essentially reaching nearly all sectors of the economy at once. So you're not having to write dozens of different regulations or subsidy bills to tackle different sectors. You get them all at once. Because they provide incentives for everyone, every consumer, every producer, every innovator in the economy at the same time, to seek out the most cost-effective way of lowering the cost of these taxes, you basically end up with the most cost-effective solution to the problem. And that's why more than 3,600 economists, including something like 28 Nobel laureates, have declared that carbon taxes are the most cost-effective solution for rapidly reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And last but not least, you actually raise revenue instead of spending money, and that gives you tremendous flexibility with that money. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but you can use this money to help households through the financial burden of decarbonization. You can help subsidize green energy more if you want to. You can reduce the deficit. You can do all sorts of things with it. Well, here you can see that carbon taxes are not at odds with the Inflation Reduction Act approach. They are in fact additive and very strongly so. Here's a chart that was created by the Coalition for a Responsible Federal, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Government. Don't worry about the numbers here so much because these are, I think, based on a very, very conservative model. The actual results probably be even better than this. But you can see Build Back Better here is basically the Biden version, the bigger version of what the Inflation Reduction Act ended up being. And you can see that it would have significantly reduced emissions from a baseline, but not as much as a $40 carbon tax would have. And when you add them together, which is the bottom red line, you get reductions that are better than both. And that's a really powerful result. The good news, furthermore, is that Resources for the Future, which is a leading DC-based environmental think tank, did a study showing that a rising carbon tax hitting $50 by 2030 would actually cut emissions 13 percentage points below that achieved by the Inflation Reduction Act or something comparable to it. And if you recall, the Inflation Reduction Act helps get us about to that 40% below 2005 level. Add another 13 percentage points, you're at 53%, which beats our Paris commitment. So that's just for the $50 carbon tax. That's great news. What's also good news to fiscal conservatives is, as I mentioned before, that the carbon tax raises money instead of spending it. So here you can see in this chart produced by that same Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, on the far left, the subsidy approach originally was going to cost $550 billion. Now it's costing us about $380 billion. But when you pair that big subsidy bill with the $40 carbon tax, you get a $900 billion surplus over 10 years. That's a lot of money to play with. So what we need to do, obviously, is figure out, okay, what do we do politically to get to a carbon tax? And we, as I say, we need to make it easier for people to act the right way. I think it's Jerno Wagner, who's an economist for Environmental Defense Fund and now at Columbia Business School, was part of a small group of political economists a few years ago who started talking about an idea called policy sequencing. And the idea was, as they say, that lower mitigation costs may reduce the opposition to carbon policy. And in his words, policymakers are more likely to price carbon appropriately if it is cheaper to move onto a low carbon path. So I think the logic of that is pretty obvious. To put it in really lay terms, people react better if you start with carrots before turning to sticks. Well, the good news is the Inflation Reduction Act helps get us there. The Resources for the Future estimates that the act will help save electricity consumers something on the order of $250 billion over the next decade. That's about $200 per household per year. And that doesn't include all the other incentives in the bill for electric vehicles, heat pumps, and so on. This chart here shows you the projected decline in retail electric rates averaged nationally through 2032. So this definitely sweetens the pot for people who, for future acceptance of a carbon tax, which will, of course, raise rates for a time. So once appreciable numbers of people start adding low carbon solutions or moving towards low carbon solutions faced with these kinds of subsidies that we've seen in the bill, then a carbon fee and dividend, our core policy, will become a genuine carrot in its own right. So I talked about the carrot and stick approach. Our policy has what should be a very prominent carrot, but sometimes has been hidden by our failure to publicize it enough, and that's the dividend. This chart, which many of you are familiar with, comes from a Treasury Department study of the impact of a $50 carbon tax and dividend. And it shows that about 70% of income deciles, so the bottom, middle income and lower income Americans, would become net beneficiaries of a carbon tax and dividend. That is, what they would receive in a monthly or quarterly check would exceed what they pay out in higher energy prices. So that's huge. And that should be a carrot that we all applaud. It's one that our neighbors to the north in Canada are working on how to publicize better, but they've implemented a policy like this. And it should be a natural follow-on to the IRA. And in addition, let's not forget that there are multiple polls showing that something like 2/3 of American voters support taxing carbon polluters. And a recent study, which I wrote about on CCL's Nerd Corner, shows that when people are informed about the pros and cons of carbon fee and dividend, that support actually goes up for that policy when they realize what a carbon dividend can do for them. So bottom line is our policies remain as important as ever, they're as timely as ever, and probably the time has never been more ripe going forward, given this policy sequencing idea, to begin moving toward a national carbon fee and dividend to get us to our Paris Agreement and to net zero by 2050. So let's go for it, and thank you. Be happy to answer some questions.